All right. Welcome to English 335. It is September 22nd. Is that right? Yes. And we are having our first kind of lecture discussion on the very first sections that I'm requiring you to read in Faulkner's Go Down Moses. I wanted to have one class where you could hear me and hopefully some of the students who have joined us today for our Zoom meeting talk about Faulkner and talk about the way that he has put the whole collection of Go Down Moses together, specifically the first two sections that you read, which are was and the old people, without requiring you to do any writing on it yet, because it is hard. It is really, really hard reading. I always start my Faulkner discussions by confessing to students that I always somehow evaded reading Faulkner as an undergrad. And I was in like honors classes and tiny little seminar classes, and one of my closest friends who I met when I was in college, who I'm still very, very close friends with, and she also has her PhD and also teaches Southern Lit and Faulkner a lot. Both of us never read it. Never. We just faked it. We just muddled through and acted like we read it because I literally did not understand it at all, and I couldn't. And came back to it as an adult, and it just blew the top of my head off and fell in love with it. So you have my sympathy and you have my understanding of how difficult it is, but I'm going to help you get through it, and I'm going to help you pick it apart. I assigned the old people and was first. Well, was is the first section. And it's there for a reason. It helps us lay the foundation of the characters and the relationships between all the characters. Sometimes it's just dropping hints, as I'll mention later, and sometimes it is really explicit as Faulkner can get, explicitly telling you who's related to whom and why. When I was talking to Wes earlier this week, I had forgotten that I had linked to like a formal family tree, because for a long, long time, I would scan, I'm just going to show you this. I would scan and post this family tree. I know you can't read it, but I just want to get the message across that it's messy, and it's on a piece of construction paper that one of my kids had laying around, and it's probably about 10 years old, my family tree of the McCaslin family, starting with Carruthers and Caslin at the top. It is messy. It is, like I said, on a piece of red construction paper. And there's all kinds of little additions that I end up or revisions that I end up making to it when I reread it, I figure something else out or need to make another note to make it clearer to me, because it is so confusing. So I'm confessing to you about how much I struggled with this and then ended up falling in love with it, because it explains to me so much about not just modern American literature, but Southern literature. It also is so crucial to my understanding in the work that I do in Native American studies and African American studies, not because Faulkner is any kind of expert on Native American experience or African American experience, quite the opposite, but because he tells us so much about the anxieties and misunderstandings that white Southerners have about Native American and African American experiences. You see that in Sam Fathers. So that's kind of my sell. That's my hard sell of how important and wonderful Faulkner is, even though I know that it's hard. So why don't y'all start by telling me or typing me what your biggest and most pressing questions are. Wes and I have already talked just a little bit about who's who. Your biggest question, Wes, was about Moses, and I couldn't even remember when we talked in the hallway that was one of the dogs' names. But
yeah, I think old Jake was also one of the mules that somebody was riding.
Right.
I think it was that? I think that was Cass's.
Right.
That he was riding.
Yep, that's who he was on.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, so just to start with one of the things that is true, I think, of all fiction, or almost all fiction, is that the first page of a book, even when it's a collection of I don't know, maybe you could call these short stories, like Go Down Moses is, the author tells you how to read his or her book on that page one. So if that is true of Go Down Moses, what is he telling us? If it is an instruction manual about this is how to read my story, what are his instructions? What is his advice? Page 3 is the first page in my book.
I don't know. I seem to think he's trying to tell you to pay attention because there's a lot there.
Yes, he's telling you to pay attention. Carol, yeah, I'm sorry. I did skip. So the first two that I'm asking you to read are Was and the Old People, but you're absolutely right. Was is the first one, and then there's two chapters or two sections in between that I am not requiring you to read. So it is the first and the fourth. Yeah, so he's telling us to pay super close attention. He's telling us who our narrator or narrators are. This is a little bit weird because he's kind of shifting. It's another framed story where you have a story inside of a story. So we start with Isaac McCaslin, Uncle Ike, past 70 and nearer 80 than he ever corroborated anymore. A widower now, an uncle to half the country, and father to no one. So who's telling us this information about Ike? Maybe it's a better question to ask. Through whose perspective are we learning this information about Ike?
McCaslin.
Yeah, Cass is telling us. This is not something participated in or even seen by himself, but by his elder cousin, McCaslin Edmonds, who is Cass. Grandson of Isaac's father's sister. It's like he's doing it on purpose. Mm-hmm. And so descended by the distaff, yet notwithstanding the inheritor, and in his time the bequester, of that which some had thought then, and some still thought should have been Isaac's, since his was the name in which the title to the land had first been granted from the Indian patent, and which some of the descendants of his father's slaves still bore in the land. Right? So he's kind of jumping back and referring to, so if we look up that family tree, Isaac or Ike wasn't even born yet, right, in the telling of this story. But Cass participates in this drama between Tommy's Turl and Tenny as a young boy. And then as he gets older, he's the one who ends up telling the story to Isaac. Cass is the one who mostly raises Ike. We learn that on the next page, actually, not something he had participated in or even remembered, except from the hearing, the listening, come to him through his own cousin, McCaslin, born in 1850 and 16 years his senior, and hence his own father being near 70 when Isaac, an only child, was born. Rather his brother than cousin, and rather his father than either, out of the old time, the old days. So we have a lot of kind of crossing of roles. Is he a brother, a cousin, or a father? He's kind of all of those things to Ike. What other family relationships are important here? We have Buck and Buddy, or Theophilus and Amadeus.
You got Tommy's Turl being mentioned as being half of McCaslin.
Right. That's the thing that he sort of just insinuates. Exactly. And that's why Mr. Hubert doesn't want him, or that's why he says he wouldn't have that damn white half McCaslin on his place, even as a free gift. And there's lots of descriptions towards the end when they're playing cards of the color of his arm, right? Faulkner loves to kind of play with this in-betweenness. On page 26, he says, they just sat there while Tommy's Turl saddle-colored hands came into the light and took up the deck. On the next page, 28, Tommy Turl's arms that were supposed to be black, but that were not quite white, up his Sunday shirt that was supposed to be white, but wasn't quite either, that he put on every time he ran away, just as Uncle Buck put on the necktie each time he went to bring him back. Right? So who is Tommy's Turl's father?
Either Uncle Buck or Uncle Buddy.
So it actually goes up a generation. So he's more of their peer. He's their half-brother.
Okay.
But his father is Carruthers McCaslin. And we don't figure out his mother's name until much later. That might be the old people. So Tommy's Turl is the product of Carruthers McCaslin's rape of one of his slaves. So he's actually the half-brother of Buck and Buddy. The other kind of weird and important thing is Cass's lineage. So he's like, in my crude little drawing, there's 4 offshoots from Carruthers McCaslin. Tommy's Turl is one of his sons. Buck and Buddy are his other 2 sons. And then he has a daughter who, to my knowledge, in all of my readings, is never named. She never has a name. And she's the mother of Cass. She marries a man whose last name is Edmonds, and then he gets the name McCaslin Edmonds. She gets the last name. He gets the last name as his first name. And so because of the way that patriarchy works and the way that race works, McCaslin Edmonds, or Cass, is the first inheritor of the McCaslin name, even though it's not his last name, it's his first name. Tommy's Turl can't be the inheritor of this because he's black. And then until Buck and Stefansaba get married, there are no other children. Buck and Buddy for a very long time are bachelors until Ike comes along. So the story in Was is also the story of how Ike gets conceived, gets made, right? How Ike comes into existence. Because Buck and Buddy are old by now. They've got no business. But Mr. Hubert is so eager to get rid of his unmarried daughter. This whole drama of Tomies Turl, Tenny, and Safansaba is all kind of a trick to do two things: to get Safansaba out of her father's hair, out of his way, out of his house. He's tired of her being there. And this is the 1850s, right? So there's no other option for a woman. Think about a rose for Emily, right? Ms. Emily Gearson. That's the fate that she's headed towards. And to get Tomies Turl and Tenny together, right? And the loser of the card game wins them all, right? And they have that whole conversation. It's all very confusing because they go back and forth. It's like double or nothing towards the end. And there is this question of like, wait, how am I winning when I am getting the two slaves, one of which keeps running away and is actually my half brother, and so that's crazy, and the woman as a wife that nobody else wants, that I don't want, but that's what Buck and Buddy end up with. And through Buck and Safansaba getting married, Ike is their child.
I thought Safansaba was Hubert's sister.
I did too for a long time.
Okay. I could have swore it said that in here. Maybe not. Maybe I just read into it.
Well, I might be wrong too. I decided somewhere along the way that it was his daughter. That she.
I mean, it seems strange that if she's that old and still having kids.
Yeah, that's true. Let's find when she's first introduced. The thing that strikes me about her when we first meet her is that she's acting like his wife.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was my initial confusion about. You're right. You're so right.
Okay, where does that say that at? 'Cause I'm still looking for it.
Page 5. Thank you, Wes. He was heading for Mr. Hubert Beauchamp's place just over the edge of the next county that Mr. Hubert's sister, Miss Safansaba, Mr. Hubert was a bachelor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're right.
Okay.
God, that's even weirder. Okay.
Yes. Maybe it's just a much younger sister.
Right.
Well, do we know how old Mr. Hubert is?
No, we don't. I mean, they say a bachelor, like blah blah blah. So he's old enough for people to have already said, okay, he's not getting married.
Yeah.
But I don't remember any conversation about him being a younger man or.
Yeah. Because it would be odd if his sister, I can never remember how to pronounce her name.
It's a crazy name.
But it would seem like in order to have a kid, she would have to be before menopause.
Sure. But think about too how long women had children, right? For a much longer period of time.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I meaning just that he could have been 50 and she could have been 40.
Yeah.
Which is still pretty crazy if Buck is 70.
True. Which I don't think that was really that uncommon.
Yeah.
As far as the age gap, not necessarily 70 and 40, but.
Sure. No, you're right. But I mean, she doesn't want it, she doesn't want it. That's probably the most hard to imagine for us part.
It almost seemed like it was from when there was a conversation that Tomies Turl had with Cass about, and I thought I had it marked of when it was, but it was almost like there was some type of plan between either Uncle Buddy, Uncle Buck, and Tommy's Turl about saying how he was just going to sit here and wait, and it was up with something, and I cannot remember what page. I thought I had it marked, and I know I made a note of it.
When they were saying if we just wait, he'll be in Tenny's cabin.
No, it was when Tommy's Turl was talking to Cass.
Oh, okay.
It was one of those times,
right.
and I wish I could find it.
Yeah. Page 12, they're crouched down together. Is that it?
Okay. Yeah, I just found my note. And he was talking about a woman's folks to working at it. Anytime you wants to get something done, from hoeing out a crop to getting married, just get the women folks to working at it.
Yeah.
Then all he needs is to sit down and wait. It was almost like there was something going on.
Yeah.
I don't know what, but it just kind of gave that impression. That stuck out to me that he would say that.
Yeah, there is definitely the suggestion that Tommy's Turl and Tenny get what they want done, which is to be together.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that Safansaba and he or she have arranged this somehow.
Yeah. And it almost seems like, I don't know why it would seem like Buddy was in on it, but he just seemed too calm at the whole, like he knew something was going to happen. Maybe he knew because something always happens, but.
Yeah. He's never he's just, so you're right. He's very calm about the whole thing. And he's the one who stays home and the one who does the cooking. You know, he's kind of the calm homebody.
Yeah. And he tells Cass, if something happens, come and get me. And, it just, he seemed too calm for everything for me.
Yeah. And he does. So by the time we finish we know a little bit about the relationship between Ike and Cass because of the way the story gets framed by, I know this story because it was told to me. Well, there's no I, but Ike knows the story because it was told to him by Cass. Cass was just a child when all of this happened. And we know that Cass is going to end up being the de facto father of Ike because this happened so late in Buck's life. We also know a little bit about race and slavery and the function that it has in this family, and maybe in the South generally. We have white and black members of the same family having different citizenship statuses, and we have it being a taboo to talk about, right? Surely Buck and Buddy at their age are aware of how Tommy's Turl came into existence, but there is no mention of it in any of the dialogue about getting him back or keeping him or letting him be with Tenny. So all of those complicated family lines as they relate to ownership and rape and gender are represented or expressed within the Carruthers and Caslin family. And we're kind of at a crucial point in American history here too, generationally. So this story is set pre-Civil War, obviously pre-emancipation, but it's coming, right? Who was the year 1850?
I think
right.
Cass was born.
Exactly. That's when he's born in 1850. They tell us that. Cass was born in 1850 and 16 years to see. So Cass is born. I'm gonna add that to my thing to give us a little bit of context. 1850 is such an important year. 1850 is the year that the Fugitive Slave Act is enacted. And so that doesn't affect the southern states very much, but it affects the whole tenor of slavery in the U.S. because it means that there basically are no free states anymore. Because if a slave escapes north, he or she has to be returned south. There is no safety. It kind of marks a more strict last hurrah of oppression and slavery for Black Americans just before the outbreak of the Civil War, before the beginning of the Civil War. It's a huge literary year as well. We have Moby Dick, Dickinson, Whitman, all kind of thinking about what America is and what America is defined by. We're at a crisis, right, at this, right in the middle of that century. It also frames for us Cass and Ike being a critical link in these generations. As you finish up the reading for next week, keep in mind kind of why their births and their lives starting at 1850 and 1866, because he's 16 years older, what they as fictional characters live through and witness happening to the South becomes very crucial. So as framers of this story, as witnesses to all of this familial and racial and regional change, it is important.
Going to the old people with Sam Fathers, I know they say Cass was kind of like a father to Ike.
Yes.
But it seems like Sam Fathers kind of molded Ike a little bit more, because in the beginning of they say all he had was a cot and a mattress to sleep on, and he didn't own anything. He gave his bungalow to his sister's wife. And when Sam was going to leave them to go to, what was it? It was one of the hunting places.
Right, the old place.
Said that he hardly had anything to own that he couldn't carry. So it seems like he kind of molded his idea of how Ike wanted to live.
Absolutely. Very good observation. And even though Cass doesn't live those values as visibly or as vocally as Ike does, so Sam molds Cass molds Ike, Sam molds Ike. So he sort of is much more of an important patriarch than their own fathers were for a whole host of reasons. So, Sam Fathers. The Old People spends a fair amount of time talking about where Sam Fathers comes from. It's complicated, of course. He comes to the Carruthers McCaslin family because he was sold when he was a child to Carruthers McCaslin. And so then Buck and Buddy inherit him. And part of what we learn in the Old People is that because he has this in-between racial identity, and because he has so much of this power, some of it's really stereotypically relying on this idea of the Indian as being like mythical and magical and supernatural and having supernatural powers. He basically just comes and tells them, I'm leaving now, and bye. And that's it. And that works. Tommy's Turtle can't do that. Other people who look like slaves can't do that. Faulkner spends a lot of time explaining to us that it's unclear what Sam Fathers' racial identity is. So he's able to kind of navigate this in-between identity that he has as a kind of privilege. which is interesting and complicated for sure, because he was sold as a slave. He was sold as property. His father was Native American and his mother was Black.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting whenever, because Cass gets inherited because of his mother, and then now when they look at the part Native Americans, or the other Native American, the full-blooded Chickasaw.
Yeah.
That was on, I think, his grandmother, but they saw him as being inferior to Sam Fathers, it was his father that was a chief,
right,
or something. So it's not really consistent, I guess, as looking at who is held higher, I guess.
Yes, it is a very strange hierarchy that in the characterizations Faulkner acknowledges completely. And the interesting thing too is that Joe Baker, I can't remember if it happens in the Old People now. Joe Baker dies first.
Yeah, that happens in the Old People.
Okay, so he's if he's the last full-blooded one, he's dead. It's the last of the Mohicans motif, right? Mm-hmm. They're dead. All of the real full-blooded Native Americans are dead. All we're left with is people like Sam Fathers. Don't really know what to do with him. He talks like a Black person. He sort of looks like a Black person. He lives with Black people, but he talks to deers, right? He has these magical powers that we literarily, stereotypically, attribute to Native Americans. Faulkner, interestingly, did do a lot of research about what Creek practices and names were. He famously had a pretty extensive library about Native American history from the area in Mississippi that he's writing about. But Sam Fathers makes his way into a couple of different collections and novels and short stories. And in different stories, he has different pasts. His father's named different things. In one story, he says he's Creek. In one story, he says he's Chickasaw. I said it wrong. He says he's Chickasaw in the Old People, and he says he's Creek in another collection. So Native American studies scholars point to it and say things like, it really didn't matter to Faulkner. He just needed an Indian. He needed an Indian to kind of represent these things that an Indian is supposed to represent. And so that's kind of what I was referring to in the beginning about how this doesn't tell us what this tells us about Southern white people's understandings, misunderstandings, and anxieties about Black and Native people is way more significant than us looking to this as an actual historic representation of the lives of Native American or African American people. It tells us more about what those perceptions might have looked like instead, which is still important, right? We can be critical of the way that he characterizes a lot of these characters, even when he's trying his best to do it thoughtfully and three-dimensionally, because it still teaches us about Southern perceptions and Southern anxieties. I also just want to point out, in the Old People, he gets on these super beautiful tangents about time in ways that I think helps us decode some of the ways that he decides to organize the story. At the very end of the Old People, I'm looking on page 179, where Ike and Cass are laying in bed trying to go to sleep, and Ike is trying to tell Cass, and he's worried that he doesn't understand him, and he says, "You don't believe it," the boy said. That's Ike. "I know you don't." And McCaslin says, "Why not? Think of all that has happened here on this earth, all the blood, hot and strong for living, pleasuring, that has soaked back into it. For grieving and suffering too, of course, but still getting something out of it, for all that, getting a lot out of it. Because after all, you don't have to continue to bear what you believe is suffering. You can always choose to stop and put an end to that." A little ways down, "And the earth don't want to just keep things, to hoard them. It wants to use them again. The boy saw his hand in a silhouette for a moment against the window, beyond which, accustomed to darkness now, he could see sky where the scoured and icy stars glittered. If they don't want it, need it, besides, what would it want itself knocking around out there when it never had enough time about the earth as it was? There's plenty of room about the earth, plenty of places still unchanged from what they were when the blood used and pleasured in them while it was still blood. But we want them, said the boy. And I saw it, he cried. I saw him. And McCaslin has to calm him down and say, I know. Sam took me in there once after I killed my first deer. So they had the same experience of knowing and understanding from Sam Fathers. And I just now learned that they shared that experience. So it's complicated in that, Faulkner is not writing a story about Sam Fathers. He's using Sam or a story about Tenny and Tommy's Turl. He's writing a story about the way that their lives affected Ike and Cass, right? And that's one of the ways that Faulkner gets rightfully criticized. Not because he didn't write another story, but he's using these colors of character in a certain way that's problematic, right? And it's representative of all of the ways that race and gender get talked about and studied in the South. They're literary devices, right? They're not fleshed out three-dimensional characters in the same way that Ike and Cass are. All right, so let me just glance at, oh dear, I'm having you read The Bear next week. The Bear is super long. I've only picked out chapters 1 and 4 of The Bear, then also Delta Autumn and Go Down Moses. Many of the same characters are central and are discussed in these sections, but we do have some new players to keep in mind. What I'm asking you to write about or to think about some of the things that we have talked about today already. How is the way the text is written help communicate what it's about? So if Faulkner is talking about a never-ending circle of life where nothing dies and everything gets regenerated, of course, his story is going to also be circular and regenerating and not have a clear A to B to C line. What do you think Faulkner is trying to suggest about slaves and slavery? This is something that I just suggested here earlier. I talk about Faulkner in a way similar to the way that I talk and think about Jefferson or somebody else who you could point to who was probably racist. Their work is so important and often so beautiful and so inspiring because it helps us understand historically peoples and groups of peoples and regions of our country's attitudes towards race and slavery. So for a minute, dig into the complicatedness of that. Where is he sympathizing slaves? Where is he being critical of brothers owning brothers? Where is he not? Where is he treating that as something that's perfectly normal and acceptable, both to the characters and also to the narrative voice? It's hard sometimes to pull that apart, whereas the author skipping over something or not skipping over something that needs to be studied or looked at in more depth, and when our characters doing that. And there are two different things, but you can try to pull them apart if that's helpful. And then the last one he starts to deal with in The Old People and continues to do it big time in The Bear is this focus on nature and the land. Definitely Delta Autumn too, because Ike is an old man in Delta Autumn. So lots has changed about the land. Think about what he's trying to suggest. What is he asking us to think about or worry about? What are the characters thinking about or worrying about in terms of the land and change and progress around nature? What else did I put down there? I have a few notes, if that's helpful, in next week's box, as well as an article and a recording. We have the great benefit of Faulkner living a nice long life and having a couple of audio recordings of lectures that he gave at UVA, where he had a sort of endowed chairship for a while. I'm thinking I'm going to go ahead and end the recording for folks who will watch it later, unless there are any questions from you two that you think the rest of the class would benefit from listening to later. All right, I'll go ahead and stop recording and we can keep talking if y'all want to. Please just email me if you have any questions.